Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are really tearing into a concept that's pretty provocative. It fundamentally challenges, how we view society, law, even morality itself.
Yeah.
The title of the source material we're unpacking is deliberately blunt. Government authority is a superstition.
It really is. And it's designed to be radical, philosophically speaking. For you, the listener, you're probably used to the standard idea that government is, well, necessary, maybe legitimate, maybe even moral.
Right, the default assumption.
Exactly. So this deep dive, it's going to be a bit of a jarring intellectual exercise, I think. We're taking Larken Rose's argument, which is actually very structured, and we're going to dissect it piece by piece.
And crucially, we're not here to endorse his conclusions. Not at all.
No, the goal is just to fully understand the chain of logic he uses, how he gets from A to B to reach those conclusions.
Precisely. So our mission today is really focused, unpack Rose's core thesis. The idea that believing some humans have a moral right to rule others is, well, irrational, a superstition, and that this belief is what actually causes so much unnecessary conflict and violence in the world.
Yeah.
We're not talking about tweaking policies here or finding better politicians or changing a few bad laws.
No. The scale of this critique is much, much bigger. It's challenging the legitimacy of the whole idea of authority, specifically government authority.
Right.
Rose argues the whole mechanism of state power, it relies entirely on a moral assumption that when you really scrutinize it, he says it just doesn't hold up.
So to really get our heads around this, we kind of need to temporarily hit pause on our usual assumptions about law and order.
Yeah, you have to. And focus purely on the foundational concept he uses, which is the non-aggression principle, the NAP.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting where Rose starts, setting up a kind of moral baseline. He paints this picture, conceptually, of a small society, people cooperating, mostly getting along, respecting each other's space, property, living peacefully.
Yes, this kind of pre-authority state, where morality is really determined by direct interaction, person to person.
And he establishes this baseline for a very specific reason, doesn't he?
He does. It's to define what true conflict actually looks like in his framework. And for Rose, genuine conflict is defined very narrowly, very strictly. It's about the initiation of harm.
Which he equates entirely with violating the non-aggression principle of the NAP.
Exactly. So we're talking about theft, physical assault, fraud. Basically, any act that starts the force or the threat of force against someone who wasn't aggressing or against their property.
So, okay, practical example.
Yeah.
If I just grab your laptop and walk off, that's genuine conflict. I initiated aggression against your property right. If I punch you, genuine conflict. Initiated aggression against your person. The conflict comes directly from violating your rights, your self-ownership or property ownership. It doesn't matter what some piece of paper, some law might say about it.
Precisely. And Rose uses this really rigid definition to draw a hard line between what he sees as inherent moral wrongs, things that violate the NAP, and things that are just violations of legal statutes.
Things that are only wrong because a rule says so.
Right. For him, the NAP isn't just a moral idea, it's the universal moral truth. So if people are just cooperating, trading, minding their own business, the natural state in this view is peace. The problem only starts when one person actively, coercively violates the rights of another.
It sounds simple on the surface, but we really need to stress how strictly Rose applies this NAP idea. He treats it as the only universal, unchanging moral standard. Aggression is wrong, period. Doesn't matter who does it or what hat they're wearing, so to speak.
Exactly. That strictness is absolutely key. Under the NAP, violence is okay only in self-defense, or maybe seeking restitution for a prior aggression. Any first use of force is immoral, full stop.
Okay.
And this simple baseline is what sets the stage for the really dramatic shift he describes when authority enters the picture. Because, according to Rose, authority, by its very nature, has to violate the NAP to exist.
So if most people are, capable of getting through life without starting fights or stealing stuff, which he seems to assume they are, then the logical thing would be to just deal with those real conflicts, the theft, the assault.
Right. But that's not what authority does, according to him.
Right.
That's the critical transition point in his argument. What happens instead, he says, is this completely arbitrary layer gets slapped on top of this natural, peaceful state. And this new layer generates conflicts that didn't need to exist, which brings us to his famous analogy.
Right. Okay. This is where the intellectual challenge really kicks in, I think. We need to introduce Rose's foundational thought experiment. It's absolutely central to his whole argument.
It's designed specifically to show how authority, in his view, doesn't just solve existing conflicts, it actively, intentionally creates new ones.
How does it start?
It starts with a political declaration. Some individual or group, they just declare themselves the ruler, the authority, and then they issue a new decree. And to make the point clear, the law has to be totally trivial, completely arbitrary, something obviously harmless in itself.
Okay.
The classic example he uses is very simple. No one may wear a purple top hat on Tuesday.
Right. Which sounds ridiculous, obviously.
Yeah.
Before that rule, someone wearing a purple top hat on a Tuesday is just, well, someone wearing a hat.
Exactly. They haven't aggressed against anyone, haven't caused any financial loss, no physical injury. It's a totally peaceful action, harms absolutely no one, neutral under the NFP.
But the second that self-declared ruler, the authority, decides to enforce that decree,
Bang. That peaceful behavior instantly becomes illegal. And this, for Rose, is the very definition of an artificial conflict. The law, in this case, isn't addressing a real moral problem, like theft. It's inventing a problem where none existed a moment before.
Okay, so this is the core mechanism he's pointing to. The person wearing the purple hat, the so-called criminal, isn't an aggressor by the NAP standard. They haven't initiated violence or fraud.
Nope.
Yet purely because of this arbitrary political rule, violence, specifically state violence, is now seen as justified against that peaceful person, all in the name of law and order.
And this leads him to a pretty stark conclusion about who the real aggressor is in this made-up scenario. He says it explicitly in the source material. The one who made the rule is the true enemy of peaceful coexistence.
Wow.
The aggression, he argues, is started not by the hat wearer, but by the entity, the state, the ruler that threatens force to stop the hat being worn or to punish the person for doing something peaceful.
Okay, if you strictly, and I mean strictly, follow the NAP as the only moral code, that really does flip the script completely, doesn't it? We're so conditioned to think the lawbreaker is the problem. But in this framework, the source of the conflict is actually the rule maker who turned a harmless, victimless act into a crime, thereby forcing a confrontation.
And this thought experiment, it's not just a quirky illustration. Rose insists we have to generalize it. He argues that government essentially functions as a massive conflict generator.
Oh, son.
Politicians, lawmakers, they are constantly, perpetually fabricating enemies. They do this by criminalizing behaviors that completely victimless, according to the NAP, and then they use these fabricated enemies, these criminals, as justification for their own power, their own budgets, their own existence.
Okay, let's make this concrete. Let's apply the purple hat logic to some real-world laws, like the source material does. Think about drug laws.
Right. If someone is, say, growing a plant for personal use or buying or using a substance privately, by Rose's standard, are they harming anyone else directly?
No. Assuming they're not, say, driving impaired or something that does aggress, just the act itself.
Just the act itself. It's peaceful, self-directed behavior, but if they're discovered...
They get arrested.
Yeah.
Violence is used against them. They're physically grabbed, put in a cage, maybe lose their job, their savings.
Exactly. And why? Not because they aggressed against another person or their property, but simply because rulers, politicians, declared that substance illegal. The state then pours huge resources into policing these non-existent victims.
And Rose would argue, again, that the police officer making the arrest, acting for the state based on that arbitrary rule, is actually the one initiating the aggression against a non-aggressor, turning a peaceful situation into a violent confrontation that the state itself is morally responsible for starting.
What about the costs? You mentioned resources.
Oh, the costs are astronomical, and this is where his analysis gets really sharp. Rose sees the entire industry built around victimless crimes, the policing, the courts, the prisons, as this massive, wasteful, and, in his view, morally bankrupt enterprise.
Millions incarcerated.
Millions. He argues they're locked up violently every year, not because they violated the non-aggression principle, but because they violated some equivalent of a purple hat rule. The whole system just burns through wealth and liberty by aiming force at peaceful people.
And it's the same logic he applies to gun control, right? Another example he uses.
Yes. Peaceful gun ownership, just the act of possessing a tool, maybe for self-defense, maybe for sport. In some places, that mere possession is criminalized. So if an agent tries to confiscate that gun or arrest the owner...
They are, in Rose's view, creating a violent confrontation where none existed. The gun owner hasn't aggressed simply by owning the object, but the state, enforcing its arbitrary rule about ownership, is initiating force or the threat of it against that person and their private property.
So this is the absolute core of this section.
Yeah.
In these cases, government isn't solving real conflict, it's creating it. It forces confrontations by threatening violence against people who are just living peacefully, not aggressing against others.
And the law itself becomes the sort of moral shield, the justification for initiating force. Force which, if you or I did it as private individuals, everyone would immediately call it what it is. Immoral, unprovoked aggression.
So the purple hat isn't just a cute story. It's Rose's universal diagnostic tool for any law that doesn't directly address theft, fraud, or assault, if there's no actual victim of aggression.
Then the law itself is creating a victim, the person targeted by the state, and initiating the violence.
Okay, that flows directly into the deeper philosophical critique then, where Rose basically insists we have to completely divorce the idea of law, statutory law, from the idea of morality.
Yes, this moral separation is absolutely critical. It underpins his entire thesis.
And the source material puts it very starkly. It quotes the core premise. Breaking the law is not immoral. Harming other people is immoral.
Right.
Which directly attacks that deeply ingrained societal notion that legality and morality are basically the same thing, or at least significantly overlap.
Exactly. We're sort of culturally trained to think that following the law is being moral and breaking the law is inherently wrong. Rose says that conditioning is the superstition.
So he's proposing a complete moral flip.
A moral inversion, yeah. He argues that if a law requires you to violate the non-aggression principle, like if your job is to threaten or cage a peaceful person for wearing a purple hat, then following that law is, by the only objective moral standard he recognizes, the NAP, actually immoral.
Okay, wow. That has huge implications for law enforcement, obviously.
Massive.
Yeah.
If the law itself is immoral because it commands aggression against peaceful people, then the government agents carrying out those orders, the police, the tax collectors, the regulators enforcing victimless crimes, they become, in his view, the actual aggressors.
The ones initiating force.
The ones initiating force against peaceful individuals. And this is where the psychological angle gets really interesting. Rose argues the state depends on its agents and even its citizens basically delegating their moral judgment upwards.
How do you mean?
Well, the enforcer, the agent, they act under the sort of moral cover provided by the state. They think, I'm just doing my job or I have to maintain order, and that shifts the perceived responsibility away from the aggressive act itself.
Ah.
And this delegation, he says, is fueled by what he calls the superstition of authority. That irrational belief that rules made up by politicians somehow magically possess inherent moral weight, overriding basic morality like don't hurt peaceful people.
That idea of complicity through moral delegation, it's pretty heavy. Because most people who support, say, drug laws, they don't feel like they're cheering for violence. They genuinely believe they're supporting safety or health or community standards.
Of course. They don't consciously see the violence inherent in the enforcement process.
But Rose would say.
Rose would argue, look, follow the process. What happens if someone peacefully refuses to comply with a victimless crime law? Ultimately, the state resorts to physical aggression, arrest, detention, caging, seizing property. There's no escaping that endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
So if you support the law that necessitates that aggression against a non-aggressor, just because it's written down on paper, then in his view, you are morally complicit in that violence. The superstition is the psychological trick that lets otherwise good people feel okay about supporting force against their peaceful neighbors.
Okay. It's a lot to chew on. Let's move to the second big analogy he uses, which is aimed right at the heart of state funding, the mafia analogy. This one feels even more confrontational.
Oh, it is. It's absolutely designed to be. The goal is to strip away all the patriotic wrapping paper or the it's necessary for society arguments around state revenue and just expose what Rose sees as the raw, coercive transaction underneath.
So he compares state funding directly to organized crime, specifically a protection racket.
Yes. Let's break down the parallel he draws point by point. First, the demand. The government demands money taxes from individuals and businesses. It's presented as non-negotiable, a condition for living or working in a certain area.
That's the protection money in the analogy.
That's the protection money. Then, second, what happens if you refuse? Rose emphasizes tax collection is not voluntary, it's enforced. If you refuse to pay or try to hide your earnings,
the state escalates.
It escalates. Starts with threats, fines, liens on your property, but it quickly moves to concrete force if you persist. They send, in his words, thugs, which he defines simply as law enforcers acting on the state's behalf to seize your assets, freeze your bank accounts, threaten you, physically cage you, or otherwise harm you.
And Rose looks at this entire structure demand for money, backed by the threat of violence for noncompliance, and says it's functionally identical to extortion.
Yes. A mafia boss demanding money with the threat, pay up or else, operates on the exact same coercive principle, he argues. The core point is that the money is taken under duress, backed by the threat of initiating force, which directly violates the non-aggression principle.
What he finds particularly fascinating, or maybe tragic,
Oh.
is that people don't just tolerate this when the state does it, they often actively cheer for it. They defend taxation as necessary, moral, the price of civilization, yet they would immediately condemn a private criminal gang using the exact same methods.
Right.
This, for him, is the ultimate proof of having fallen for the game, as he puts it. People end up cheering for violence against those who haven't committed violence simply because the aggressor wears a government badge and calls the extortion taxation. The power of the analogy is really enforcing you, the listener, to just ignore the label taxation for a moment and look purely at the underlying mechanics. Demand plus threat of force, coercion. Why is one legal and celebrated and the other illegal and condemned?
And Rose's answer is always the same: superstition. The widespread, irrational belief in the moral authority of the state to do things that would be considered immoral for anyone else.
And he doesn't stop at domestic issues. He extends this whole fabricated conflict idea into the international realm too, right? Specifically with borders and immigration laws.
Yes, he sees borders and immigration restrictions as perhaps the grandest, most encompassing purple hat rule of them all.
How does that connect back?
Well, it connects perfectly to the original principle. Wearing a hat is harmless in itself. Moving your body across an invisible line on a map is also inherently a harmless physical act.
The crucial distinction, I guess, is that crossing a line on a map isn't inherently aggressing against anyone's property, unlike trespassing on someone's actual private land.
That's the absolute core of his argument here. Governments, he says, claim ownership and control over vast territories, land they often acquired through historical aggression, not legitimate homesteading or purchase. And then they enforce boundaries against peaceful people trying to move.
So someone moving across this imaginary political line becomes illegal.
Exactly. They become a criminal, not because they harmed anyone, stole anything, or committed fraud, but purely because the rulers declared their peaceful movement unauthorized across territory that, in Rose's anarchist view, no political entity can legitimately claim exclusive control over in the first place.
And the consequence of that fabricated conflict
Is that ordinary people, who would otherwise have no reason for conflict with these movers, are manipulated into hostility. They're encouraged to fear or resent the illegal alien, someone who has done nothing wrong according to the NIP, simply because they crossed an arbitrary government-drawn line on a map.
So it's another instance where the state, or rather the belief in the state's authority to define and violently defend these arbitrary boundaries, is the actual source of the conflict.
Precisely. It turns peaceful human interaction, movement, trade, migration into a source of legal trouble, confrontation, and violence. The system generates the conflict, then steps in claiming legitimacy by solving the very problem it just created.
So whether we're talking about a trivial rule like a purple hat, or something as fundamental as taxation, or as large-scale as border control, Rose's consistent argument is that the state is the primary initiator of unprovoked violence, justified only by this fiction, this superstition of authority.
Okay, so this brings us to the final section of his argument, where the focus shifts entirely. It moves away from analyzing the mechanics of authority and zeroes in on what he sees as its engine, its power source.
Which isn't primarily guns or force.
No. He claims the power of the ruler fundamentally doesn't come from their weapons. It comes from the compliance, or more accurately, the belief of the people being ruled.
Ah, right. This is the core psychological critique.
It really is. Rose argues that authority is ultimately an illusion, a kind of shared delusion. Rulers can issue commands, sure, but if the vast majority of people simply ignored those commands, if they stopped believing the rulers had a moral right to issue them in the first place,
The whole structure would just collapse.
instantly, he argues, the whole mafia racket, as he calls it, would evaporate. The system isn't sustained by the ruler's own force, but by widespread popular obedience rooted in belief.
So if everyone refused to pay the taxman peacefully, or if every police officer refused to arrest someone for a victimless crime like the purple hat,
The system just stops working. The ruler, the president, the king, they don't personally hold all the guns. They rely entirely on millions of other people, the enforcers, the bureaucrats, the citizens, believing in their legitimacy enough to use their energy, their resources, their force on the ruler's behalf.
that's a really bold claim he makes then. that all state violence, everything from wars fought overseas to taxes collected at home from people being imprisoned for nonviolent acts to censorship, it all hinges entirely on people's willingness to accept political authority as morally valid.
He states it very bluntly. The rules have no power unless you are dumb enough to believe they do.
Wow, that's incredibly confrontational.
Yeah.
And it's aimed squarely at you, the listener, isn't it?
Yeah.
It fundamentally puts the responsibility for the whole system continuing, not really on the politicians,
No.
but on the millions, maybe billions of ordinary people who grant them legitimacy through what he calls this superstitious belief.
It's the ultimate decentralization of blame, in a way, or maybe responsibility. If authority is just a myth in people's heads, then the real power doesn't lie with the person wearing the crown or sitting in the Oval Office. It lies with the millions of people who believe that crown or that office grants special moral powers.
And without that collective belief.
The ruler is just some guy or some woman shouting orders that nobody follows. Just an ordinary person issuing empty threats.
Okay, but we have to address a practical point here, a potential hole maybe. If we completely reject government authority based on the NAP, as Rose advocates, what about things that seem to require large-scale coordination? Collective goods.
Like roads or defense.
Exactly. Who builds the highways?
Yeah.
Who funds basic scientific research? Who defends against a genuine external aggressor, say, a foreign power that is actually violating the NAP on a massive scale?
Yeah.
How does Rose reconcile the need for collective security or infrastructure with this strict non-aggression rule?
That's a critical question. Rose's position, and this is really important to understand within his framework, is that the question of how services get provided is secondary to the question of moral legitimacy. Meaning, he would argue that solving the road problem or the defense problem through coercion through taxation, which he sees as extortion, is inherently immoral even if the roads are useful or the defense is needed.
So the ends don't justify the means, in his view.
Never. He suggests that genuine needs, things people actually value, would find ways to be met through voluntary cooperation, private enterprise, mutual aid societies, voluntary defense associations, market mechanisms. But he absolutely insists that no practical benefit can ever justify violating the non-aggression principle. If the only way to get roads is through theft, then that system is immoral and must be rejected.
Okay, that makes sense within his logic. The moral foundation, the NAP, has to be paramount. So let's get to the final psychological reckoning that Rose presents. If you accept his premises, it leads to a really harsh self-critique for anyone who still believes in government authority.
Yeah, it does, he asks. If you say you want peace, if you genuinely desire a peaceful world, yet you support using violence against peaceful people just because they broke the law.
Like the peaceful tax protester, the person quietly owning a banned firearm, the migrant crossing an imaginary line without harming anyone.
Right. If you support initiating force against them, Rose argues you are fundamentally contradicting your stated desire for peace. You can't logically be pro-peace while simultaneously endorsing the initiation of violence against non-aggressors.
So in his view, you become part of the problem you're lamenting.
Exactly. You are actively helping to perpetuate the very conflict and violence you claim to dislike. You're not upholding peace. You're upholding the arbitrary power structure that generates the conflict in the first place.
And his closing message is really directed right at the individual believer, isn't it? It shifts from criticizing government to a kind of internal moral check.
It's incredibly personal and blunt. He basically says, if you're complaining about all the violence, the war, the division in the world, and yet you still believe that government is a legitimate moral authority, that it has the right to command people to initiate force against the peaceful, then, as he puts it, you need to look in the mirror.
The implication being?
The implication is stark. The violence exists, in large part because of your belief system. You are the fuel that keeps the engine of state aggression running. It's this assertion that the belief in authority itself is the single biggest driver of organized violence and social division.
And if you dissolve that superstition, if people just stop believing that politicians have a special moral right to rule,
then the conflicts generated by that belief system dissolve with it. The purple hat conflicts, the tax conflicts, the border conflicts, they all vanish, he argues, once the underlying coercive authority based on mere belief is removed.
So the ultimate takeaway from Rose isn't about political reform at all.
Not in the slightest. It's about a fundamental philosophical shift, an awakening, where individuals stop outsourcing their moral judgment to politicians and return exclusively to what he sees as the only objective foundational moral guide, the non-aggression principle. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive into an extremely challenging and, let's be honest, pretty uncomfortable philosophical position. Let's try to quickly boil down the core framework Larken Rose presented in this source material, just so you have the key takeaways clear.
Yeah, we can probably break his argument down into maybe four key interconnected pieces. First, the absolute foundation. Authority is a superstition. It's just an irrational belief, he says, that some humans magically get a moral right to rule others and initiate violence. And that belief is the psychological bedrock everything else rests on.
Okay. Second, there's the mechanism. Fabricated conflict. That's the purple hat analogy at work. Laws created by this supposed authority often just criminalize victimless actions, turning peaceful people into enemies and forcing confrontations that mainly benefit the rulers by justifying their power.
hmm Third, there's the psychological consequence, the moral inversion. This is where people get turned around viewing peaceful disobedience like wearing the hat as somehow wrong or dangerous, while they see the state's violent enforcement of these arbitrary rules as moral, necessary keeping order. It allows them to cheer for aggression against non-aggressors without feeling bad.
Right. And force the economic engine, as he sees it, the government as mafia concept. This draws that direct, stark parallel between how taxes are demanded and enforced and how organized crime runs extortion rackets. Both rely on demanding payment under the threat of initiating violence.
So Rose's central, unwavering message, the big takeaway, is crystal clear. The only legitimate moral code is the non-aggression principle. Don't initiate force or fraud against others, period. And achieving real lasting peace, therefore, requires nothing less than completely abolishing the belief in government as a legitimate moral institution. Any law that contradicts the NIP is, by definition, just institutionalized aggression.
The entire framework really stands or falls on accepting that non-aggression principle as the sole and sufficient basis for all morality and social organization.
Absolutely. And, that leads directly to the final, really provocative thought we should probably leave you, the listener, with.
Which is?
Well, if we accept the non-aggression principle as the sole standard, and if we agree with Rose's framework that we must abolish the belief in a coercive authority structure, how then would society handle the genuine conflict?
You mean the real stuff? The theft, the assaults, the frauds, the original conflicts that actually do violate peaceful coexistence according to the NAP.
Exactly. If the traditional state structures are gone because their very foundation is deemed immoral, who steps in?
Yeah.
Who arbitrates disputes? Who enforces restitution for victims? Who prevents cycles of revenge and retaliation?
Without accidentally recreating the very system of authority, the very belief in a right to coerce. That was just torn down. That's the massive challenge, isn't it?
That is the ultimate challenge Rose's premise leaves us grappling with. Understanding his critique is one thing. Designing a truly non-aggressive, voluntary framework for justice, defense, and cooperation that actually works in the real world. Well, that's another matter entirely.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope this exploration, challenging as it was, gives you a new, perhaps unsettling lens through which to view the very concept of authority and its complex relationship to peace.